I've got the woe begone, down low Mifwump Blues. But grandfather's garden is the cure for the Mifwump Blues.
Hello everyone, I'm Brie Mathers and I'm back to read another episode from our wonderful storytime collection, Grandfather's Garden by David Loye. And today our story is called Tumbling Tumbleweeds. And here is the wonderful illustration to go with it. Looks like a couple of tumbleweeds. Here we go. Once upon a time, there was a tumbleweed in the desert named Myrtle. And the first thing that Myrtle decided was that she didn't like her own name. She said, "Henceforth, I shall be called Muriel." The second thing she didn't like was that she just didn't like this business of flopping around on the desert every time the wind blew, for that is what happens with tumbleweeds. Every time the wind blew, all these tumbleweeds would take off and flop around the desert and then bang up all together and form a clump, and then they'd be blown apart again. Muriel told a friend of hers, another tumbleweed named Baxter, what she thought about this arrangement. "Baxter," she said, "if I ever get a chance, I am going to stop this business of being blown around the desert by every passing wind and not having roots in anything. This is no life," she said. And Baxter said, "You're right, Myrtle." "Now wait, Baxter," she said, "remember what I told you?" Yes, I'm awfully sorry, Myrtle. I mean, Muriel. He said, "I'm with you there, Muriel, but I don't know how we can ever do it. We're just tumbleweeds, and that's the way it's always been with tumbleweeds, always is and always will be." Like in the song in the old Western movies with Roy Rogers and Trigger and the Sons of the Pioneers, we're tumbling tumbleweeds. It's the tumbleweed thing. But Muriel said, "I don't care if that's the way it's been ever since time began. I've had enough of this situation, and I'm changing it first chance I get." Well, the months passed by. Every windstorm blew them apart, and then they'd get clumped together again, and then blown apart again, and sometimes she wouldn't see Baxter for weeks. Then another wind would come, and there he would be, blowing around the corner of a house toward her. She was always glad to see him. She kept thinking that her chance would come in January or February when the rains came. You see, she had formulated a plan. Her plan was that when the rains came, she would try to sink her roots into the ground long enough so that her roots would get so strong they could hold her in place when the wind came. She wanted to tell Baxter her plan, but he'd been blown off somewhere else. One day the winds came up and she saw him coming around the house toward her. Oh, she was so happy because at last she could tell him her plan and maybe they could root together somewhere. He came swooping up on the wind and bumped up against her and said, "Muriel, how wonderful! How wonderful to see you." And she said, "Baxter, all these weeks there has been something awfully important I've wanted to tell you." And he said, yes, there's been something awfully wonderful I want to tell you, Muriel." And he began a long story. It was all about how he'd been blown out on the water and then swept ashore, and how he'd been blown down a highway between 1,000 cars and trucks and almost run over a zillion times. And he went on and on and on, and every now and then she would say, "Well, this is all very interesting, Baxter, but I just want to say," and he'd say, please, Muriel, don't interrupt." He would say, "Muriel, what you've got to understand is that when I'm wound up this way, when I haven't seen you in such a long time, why, you've just got to sit there and listen for a while at least. Let me have my say." And so he was starting to launch into a tale of how he was blown up on a truck bed of a big truck that was carrying cars to Wyoming when another big wind came up, and she was just saying, "Baxter, please, I've got something important to tell you." But the wind blew him away. Stopped by the school bell. She didn't see him again for weeks, and she said to herself, "When I see him again, before he can open his mouth and go off on another long story, I'm just going to say real fast, Baxter, when it rains, sink your roots. Try to get near me, sink your roots, okay? So all of a sudden, she saw him come blowing around the edge of a school building. And she was so glad to see him, and she called out, Baxter! And he called out, Muriel! She was just revving up to tell him when the school bell rang, and all these children came running out from the school for recess. They ran right between Baxter and Muriel, and for a while she couldn't see him at all because of this mob of school children shooting past. And when they had all passed, he was gone. He had been blown off somewhere else. Well, it went on like this another time. She was blowing about and she saw Baxter, and they were just across from each other on either side of a railroad track. She called out, Baxter! And he called out, Muriel! But just like it had happened with the school children, a train came rushing by, and by the time it had passed, she had been blown off one way, and he had been blown off in the other direction. Well, the rains came, and she hadn't had a chance to tell Baxter about her plan. She didn't see him anywhere. She thought to herself, well, even though I hate to root myself in the ground without Baxter, the most important thing for me to do is to establish something new and different for tumbleweeds, roots. Deep roots in the ground. So when the rains came and the grounds got all squishy and soft, all the other tumbleweeds just flopped around as usual, but Muriel worked very hard and shoved her roots into the soil, and then she concentrated on making her roots grow as fast as possible. And sure enough, she was able to root herself so that when the first big wind came and all the other tumbleweeds blew off, Muriel remained rooted in the soil. But as the months went by, she began to wonder if she had done the right thing after all. On one hand, she was feeling good about the fact that she had succeeded in rooting herself in the ground so she couldn't be blown away. But on the other hand, she was feeling lonely because she was there all by herself. The difficulties of being the first to do something. Once in a while, the wind would blow and a tumbleweed would come tumbling around, but they hardly recognized her anymore. You see, instead of being all dried out and dusty and gray, as was normal for tumbleweeds, with her roots firmly in the ground to get water regularly, Muriel was now a bush with leaves and green and yellow. She tried to talk to her old friends among the tumbleweeds or just anybody who came blowing by, and they were polite, but she could see that they felt she'd changed so much that they didn't have anything in common with her anymore. So a year or two passed, and she was increasingly lonely. She thought often of Baxter and wondered if she would ever see him again. She realized then that making her choice to try to advance evolution, to try to advance tumbleweeds up the scale of life, to try to give them roots somewhere, she had probably cut herself off from all the rest of her species. It was very sad for her, but she took what comfort she could in being a pioneer. And so it was that there came up a tremendous storm and the ground shook. It wasn't just a storm, it was an earthquake, and the ground shook and roared and great cracks appeared and buildings fell down and everything from soup to nuts went flying off in all directions. And it just rained and rained and rained, and the wind blew. And one morning she woke up, and to her great surprise, there was Baxter. Baxter's return. He had been blown for miles, and his roots were sunk in the squishy ground right next to her. When he woke up, he was so glad to see her. He said, "You've changed, Muriel. I just wonder what we have in common now. You're so fresh and lovely and all green and yellow, and I'm such a poor, dried out, gray old thing." "Don't fret, dear," Muriel said. "You look lovely beyond description to me. Please now work to strengthen your roots stuck in that mud and to draw strength and sustenance from the ground so that you can stay there when the winds come." And so he did. And he was beginning to turn just a little green when the winds came. He tried to hold on. He said, "Muriel, I'm trying." She said, yes, you must hold on, Baxter." And he said, "I'm trying, Muriel, but it's an awfully strong wind." And it looked like the wind was going to blow him away. His voice was getting weaker and weaker, and finally he said, "Muriel, I can't hang on any longer." And she thought for sure that all was lost. But just at that moment, a milk truck came by, and it parked in such a way that it cut off the wind from blowing on Baxter, and Baxter was able to hang on. It was because of the way the milk truck was parked, blocking the wind, and he was able to hang on, and soon he began to turn green and yellow like her, and then after a bit, they began to have their own little tumbleweed children, and so Muriel and Baxter's whole family began to spread out from them, all green and yellow. They still thought of themselves as tumbleweeds, of course, only now they weren't tumbleweeds anymore. Clement T. Middlecamp and Phoebe Q. Mollendorf and Muriolantis and Baxteronis. A professor came by. He didn't realize what they had been before, and he announced that he had found this new plant that was a lovely green and yellow and was distinguished by its awfully strong roots wherever it was planted, and he wondered what to call it. His name was Professor Middlecamp, Professor Clement T. Middlecamp. He taught at the University of Michigan in the winters. In the summers, he taught at the University of Missouri. Dr. Clement T. Middlecamp wondered what to call this new species of plant that he had found, and one night in a dream there appeared to him a lonely tumbleweed tumbling over the desert. And the strangest thing happened. For this tumbleweed had a voice, and this tumbleweed said in a far-off, squeaky little voice, "Dr. Clement T. Middlecamp, I have a name. And that name shall be your name for the species of this new organism. I am Muriel the tumbleweed, only now I'm no longer a tumbleweed. You shall call me Muriolantis." And so it was. When he woke up, he wrote down the dream and said, "That's very strange. It's almost as if it were real, as if it had really happened." And he announced to the scientific world the discovery of this new plant that was to be called Muriolantis. And Dr. Clement T. Middlecamp met a wonderful woman, and they became married, and she had a dream. And in her dream, another tumbleweed appeared and said, "My name is Baxter, and I used to be a tumbleweed, but now I'm a new species called Muriolantis, but that's only part of it. I, too, Baxter, was involved in this process of evolution, and all these former tumbleweed children are partly mine. Remember," he called to her out of the dream in a far-off little voice, "my name is Baxter." Professor T. Middlecamp's wife's name was Professor Phoebe Q. Mollendorf, for they had both kept their original names. So Phoebe Q. Mollendorf told Clement T. Middlecamp of her dream, and they decided to call the new species of tumbleweed Muriolantis and Baxteronis. So that became its name in a real world. And this was quite an honor, but there was a problem. For there still yearned within Muriel and Baxter for something they could still feel, even though they didn't know what or why. For now their name was shrunk to little more than a wan Latin phrase, as withered and dry on the page as Muriel and Baxter had been in their earlier life in Storyland. And so it was, that in the miraculous way the real world is connected to Storyland. They left the page that honored their contribution to evolution to shoot out into the unknown to live forever. And plump and green and yellow and loving each other, they populated vast continents of desert into lush new lands in the mind. A moral for the story. Sometimes it takes a long time to get out of life what we want. Or something in the world is working in favor of true love, no matter how hard this may be to believe at times.
I've got the woe begone, down low Mifwump Blues. But grandfather's garden is the cure for the Mifwump Blues.